The carriage had brought her through the night, and now, in the gray hour before sunrise, it left her standing at a gate that would not fully close. Aloan Ashford, a bride of one day, a duchess by a signature and a hurried vow, watched her husband mount his horse in the cold. He had not slept under the same roof. He had not slept at all, by the look of him. Corin, the Duke of Winthorpe, sat straight-backed in the saddle, his face the color of the dawn behind him, and he did not meet her eyes. "Renmere is yours now," he said. "The staff will see to your needs." She looked past him at the house. Its windows were dark, its ivy had grown over 3 of them entirely, as though the manor were trying to close its own eyes. "You are leaving," she said. "Not a question." She had learned in her 19 years not to waste breath on questions that already had their answers. "I have business in the north that cannot wait." A muscle moved in his jaw. "You are not well enough to travel." The physicians were plain about that. The physicians had been plain about a great many things, most of them wrong, but Eowyn said nothing. She had married this stranger to keep her father from a debtor's cell, and a woman who has bought her family's freedom does not then argue over the price of it. By spring, Corin said, matters will be settled. He gathered the reins. For one moment, so brief she might have imagined it, his gaze flicked to her, and there was something behind it that was not coldness at all, something nearer to grief. Then it was gone. He rode out through the broken gate without once looking back. She listened to the hoofbeats fade into the waking fields until there was nothing left of him but the mist he had disturbed in passing. Aloan stood alone before the dark and silent house that was now, by law, entirely hers, and she smiled. Renmere Hall had been dying for a long time. Aloan walked its rooms alone that first morning, and the house told her its history in the language of ruin. Damp had bloomed across the plaster of the great hall like continents on a map. The long dining table wore a shroud of dust so thick that her finger left a clean, dark line drawn through it. In the drawing room, a bird had come down the chimney one winter and never found its way out again. Its small bones lay in the cold grate among the ash. There was a staff, as her husband had promised, though staff was a generous word for what remained. An old cook named Mrs. Pell, who had gone half-deaf and wholly sour. A groundsman called Bram, older still, who tended the kitchen garden out of habit more than wages, for the wages, she would soon learn, had not come in some months, that was all. 2 aging souls rattling about 40 empty rooms like the last 2 seeds in a dry pod. "Nobody stays at Renmere, milady," Mrs. Pell said, setting down a supper of thin broth and harder bread without ceremony. "The young ones go to the mills, the old ones die, and the money," she sniffed, "the money goes wherever Mr. Vane sends it." Aloan filed the name away. "Vane." She said nothing. That night she could not sleep. The great bed was cold and the whole room smelled of neglect, so she took a candle and walked, because walking was what she had always done when her mind would not settle. She had been raised on a working farm before her father's fortunes rose and then fell away beneath him. She knew the sound a house was meant to make, and this one was too quiet, as though it were holding its breath and waiting to see what she would do. She found the estate office at the end of a corridor she had not yet explored. The door was locked, but the mistress of Renmere held the key to every door in it, and that key they had remembered to give her. Inside, a desk, a dead fire, and shelves of ledgers furred gray with dust. Years upon years of accounts, abandoned. She lifted her candle and ran the light along them. All neglected, all forgotten, all but one. On the desk, set apart from the rest, lay a single ledger with no dust upon it at all. It had been used, and used recently, and then left lying open, carelessly, by someone who had never once imagined that the mistress of a dying house might come walking through it in the dark. Aloan set down her candle, drew the ledger toward her, and began to read. By the 3rd page, she knew that something was wrong. Aloan had kept her father's books from the age of 12. First as a game he set her of an evening. Later as the quiet duty that kept a roof above them, both when his health began to fail. She could read a column of figures the way other women read a face, and this ledger, for all its neat and confident hand, was lying to her. The rents were the trouble. Renmir's tenant farms had paid their dues faithfully. She could see the sums come in, season upon season, in good honest coin, but the figures that went out again did not answer to them. Repairs were recorded for barns that she would later find had not felt a new nail in a decade. A drainage works upon the North Fields had been paid for in 3 separate years. And every vanished pound, every crooked little sum, was written in the same steady hand and signed with the same 3 letters, O. V. Osric Vane, the land agent, the man the money followed. Aloan closed the ledger, and for a long moment she sat in the cold office with her heart beating hard, not with fear, but with the old sharp thrill of a puzzle that wished to be solved. Someone had been quietly bleeding this estate for years, trusting that no one who mattered would ever trouble to look. Her husband was gone. The house was thought to be dying. And she, the frail bride, sent here to fade away without complaint, was the one person on earth no one had thought worth guarding against. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a far better kind of sleeplessness. In the morning she did a thing no mistress of Renmir had done in living memory. She put on her plainest gown and her old farm boots, and she walked out to see the land with her own eyes. The fields told her more than any ledger could. She found the north drainage choked and stagnant, plainly never touched. She found barns with their roofs open to the sky and pasture gates hanging from a single hinge. And in a low green valley the morning mist had not yet left. She found an old man mending a stone wall with his bare hands, because no one had ever sent him the mortar he had asked for 4 times over. He straightened when he saw her, wary in the way men grow wary of gentry come walking. "Ambrose Fenn," he said when she asked his name. "I hold the low pastures, held them 40 year." He looked her over. The fine gown gone muddy at the hem, the level and unhurried eyes. "You'll be the new Duchess then. Come to see what you've been handed, or come to sell it?" "Neither yet," Aloan said. "Come to understand it." Something shifted behind the old man's weathered face. Before he could put a word to it, a small figure came darting out from behind the wall. A girl of perhaps 6 years, all bare knees and tangled hair, who had plainly been listening to every word. "That's my granddaughter, Tamsin. Beg pardon, milady, there's no fear in the child." But Tamsin had already crossed the grass and planted herself before the Duchess, staring up with a frank and fearless curiosity. Then, saying nothing, she held out one small closed fist and opened it. In her palm sat a single early blackberry, dark and perfect and warm from the carrying of it. "For you," the child said. "You looked sad." Aloan knelt down in the wet grass, took the berry as though it were a jewel, and felt, for the first time since her wedding morning, something in her chest come quietly loose. "Thank you," she said. "It is the finest gift I have been given in a very long while." And over the child's head Ambrose Fenn watched the new Duchess kneel in the mud of his pasture, and slowly, thoughtfully, he set down his trowel. They called her Frail, and there was a reason for it, though it was not the reason they supposed. 2 winters past, a fever had swept through the market town where Aloan and her father then lodged. It had taken the miller and 2 children on their street, and it had very nearly taken her. For 11 days she had burned and shivered by turns, and the physician, a grave man paid by the hour, had told her father to prepare himself. She had not died. She had risen from that bed, thinner and paler than before, with a cough that lingered into spring, and the town had decided among itself that the Ashford girl was delicate, marked, not long for the world. It had suited her father to let them think it. A delicate daughter drew sympathy from creditors, where a hale one drew only demands. And when the Duke of Winthorpe's men came seeking a quiet, biddable, undemanding bride, a wife who would ask little and trouble no one, a girl reputed to be fading gently toward her grave, was precisely what they wished to find. The truth was that Elowen Ashford had the constitution of the farm women who had raised her. She had risen before dawn to milk and frozen byres. She had carried water and turned hay and set her shoulder to a stuck cartwheel beside grown men. The fever had bent her once. It had not broken anything that mattered. She let them go on calling her frail, because a woman thought to be frail was a woman left alone, and being left alone, she had long ago discovered, was its own quiet kind of freedom. As for why she had agreed to be sold to a stranger, for it was a selling. Whatever gentler word the lawyers had used for it, the debt was only the half of it. Her father would have found some other bridge across his ruin. He always did, and it always crumbled beneath him in the end.
No.
When the offer came, Elowen had looked at the long gray years stretching out ahead of her, nursing a man who loved his own excuses better than he had ever loved her, dwindling in a rented room until the town's prophecy came true of its own accord. And she had thought, quite calmly, I would rather be given a house I have never seen than die in one I have come to hate. She had not expected the house to be a corpse, but a corpse, she was beginning to think, might yet be coaxed back to breathing. And she had never in the whole of her life owned anything at all. That was the vow she made herself that second gray morning, with the memory of Vane's dishonest ledger still sharp behind her eyes. Whatever this place is, it is mine now, and I will not stand aside and let a thief carry it off in the dark, while every soul in the county agrees that I am too weak to notice. So, she did not hide what she was doing. That was her first mistake, or else her cleverest stroke. She had not yet decided which. She sent Bram into the county town with a short and courteous letter, requesting that the estate's man of business forward the rent rolls and the accounts of the past 7 years to the hall for the mistress's review. She drew from Mrs. Rao, end of now, Pell, over 3 patient conversations, the name of every tenant family, and which had gone, and why. And each morning she walked the fields and wrote down what she saw in a small book of her own, in a hand as neat and sure as any land agent's. It took 9 days for that letter to find its way to Osric Vane. He read it twice, standing at the window of his comfortable office in the town, and then he laughed, a short, unbothered sound, a dying girl playing at accounts. He very nearly fed the thing to his fire. Then he read it a 3rd time, and he stopped laughing. Osric Vane came to Renmere Hall himself, and he came within the fortnight, which told Elowen, more than any ledger could, how greatly her letter had unsettled him. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. He was the sort of thief who prospers precisely because he looks so entirely like an honest one, soft-spoken, well-brushed, with a manner of folding his hands and inclining his head that suggested nothing in the world so much as patient concern. He arrived in a good coat and a better carriage than the one the Duke's own bride had been sent north in, and he bowed over her hand with every appearance of respect. "Your Grace," he said, "I confess your letter alarmed me. To trouble your health with dusty accounts, it will not do. It will not do at all. That is the whole purpose of an agent. You must let me carry these tedious burdens as I carried them for his Grace's late father, and for his poor brother before." He caught himself a breath too late. Elowen marked it, the swallowed word brother, and set it down carefully beside all the rest. "You are kind to fret over my health," she said pleasantly, "but I find the country air has done wonders for it. Do sit, Mr. Vane. I have 1 or 2 questions." She watched the exact moment his concern went cold and still behind his eyes. But he sat, and he answered, and over the next hour he built for her, brick by patient brick, the picture of an estate beyond all saving. Renmere was drowning in debt, he explained gravely. Old debts, the late lord's debts, debts that had been mounting quietly for years. The land was tired and sour. The tenants were idle and far behind on their rents, some of them years in arrears. It grieved him more than he could say, but a buyer had lately made inquiries, a reasonable man, a manufacturing gentleman from the north, and the kindest thing, The sensible thing, the very thing he had already begun gently to press upon his grace, was to sell Renmere entire and be free of the whole sorry burden of it. "And the families upon the land?" Iloan asked. "The tenants who are, as you say, so far behind?" Vane spread his soft hands. "Arrears must be answered, your grace. A new owner will wish the land cleared and let afresh. It is a hard thing, but it is only business." There it was then, the whole of it, laid out before her by the very man who had built it. He had bled the estate for years and written the theft down as debt. He had let the farms rot, so the rot could be blamed upon idle tenants, and now, with Renmere made to look worthless, he would sell it to a buyer. She would have staked her life was Osric Vane himself under a borrowed name and pocket the estate twice over. The quit notices were surely drawn already. All that he wanted now was a poor harvest to prove his story true. And a poor harvest with the barns open to the sky, and the drainage choked and the men without heart in them, was very nearly a certainty, unless someone gave them a reason to hope otherwise. She saw Vane out with every courtesy, watched his fine carriage down the long drive, and then she sent Bram to every farm on the estate with the same short message. "The Duchess of Winthorpe asks that the tenants of Renmere meet with her at the hall before the week is out." They came reluctantly, in twos and threes, 20 families worth of wary, weathered people who had learned the hard way that when the hall summoned them, it was never with good news. They stood in the ruined great hall with their caps twisting in their hands and waited to be told how they were to be ruined. Iloan did not seat herself above them. She stood among them in her plain gown, and she told them the truth. Not the whole of it, but enough. That the accounts had been robbed, that the debts were in the main inventions, that there was a scheme afoot to call them idle, prove it with a failed harvest, and turn every last one of them off the land their grandfathers had broken. "I cannot yet prove it to a magistrate," she said. "But I need not prove it to you, for you have lived it. You have begged for mortar, and been sent none. You have paid your rents in good coin and watched your own roofs fall in upon you. You know who has done this to Renmere. And I am telling you, to your faces, that I mean to stop him." A long silence answered her. Then a broad man near the back, Harwick, who held the mill field, spat upon the flagstones. "Fine words," he said. "We've had fine words from the hall before. And what's a dying girl to do against Osric Vane, and the law, and a duke that's run off north and left her here to rot?" It was Ambrose Fenn who answered him, before Iloan could draw the breath to. The old man stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and he did not look at Harwick but at all the others. "I watched this one kneel down in my own pasture to take a blackberry out of my granddaughter's hand," he said. "In the mud, in her wedding silk, near enough to it. I've held my low pastures 40 year, and I've seen every kind of gentry come and go over them, and I'll tell you plain, she's the first of the lot ever looked at me like I was a man and not a rent to be collected." He turned to Iloan. "You bring us in this harvest, your grace. You tell us how. My family's yours, and one by one then. Not all together, but one by one, which is the only way that trust is ever truly given." The caps came off, and the slow nods came, and 20 families cast in their lot with the frail bride who would not fade. They did not yet know what it would cost them. 200 miles to the north, in a cold rented house at the edge of a colliery town, Corin Winthorpe read his land agent's letter twice, and then set it down as though it had grown heavy in his hand. His wife was fading. Osric Vane wrote with every show of gentle regret. She kept to the hall. She occupied herself with small domestic matters, as invalids so often will, to pass the hours that were left to her. There was, the agent hinted delicately, between the careful lines, not a great deal of time remaining. His grace would be wise to let his thoughts turn, when grief allowed, to the disposition of Renmere and the settling of its affairs. Corin rose and went to the window. Below him the town lay under a sky the color of slate, and somewhere beneath the black hills, the pumps labored day and night over the flooded workings that had swallowed his brother's fortune, and very nearly the family's name along with it. Julian had done this. Julian, the elder, the golden one, the brother whom everyone had loved on sight, Julian had poured the whole strength of the dukedom into a mine that any cautious man alive would have left in the ground, and then had broken his neck at a fence 3 days before the first gallery flooded, leaving Corin to stand alone in the wreckage of it and lie to the world with a level face. That was the truth that no soul at Renmere knew. The Duke of Winthorpe was not cold. The Duke of Winthorpe was drowning quietly, and by inches, in a debt he had never made, and fighting with every hour God gave him to keep it hidden long enough to be mended. And the girl, Eloan, the girl was a part of that lie, and he knew it, and it shamed him more than all the rest of it together. He had needed a wife who would ask nothing of him. Not his heart, for his was no fit thing to offer anyone in such a season. Not her fortune, for she had none. Not even her health, for she was said to have precious little of that. A quiet, undemanding marriage to a gentle, dying girl that had seemed, in the black winter when it was arranged, very nearly a mercy on both sides. He would clear her father's debt and give her a title and a roof to die beneath, and she would make no claim upon a man who had nothing left in him to give. He had told himself, riding away in the dawn, that he was being kind. Standing now at the window, with the pumps grinding on under the hills, he was no longer certain that kindness and cowardice were such very different things. He took up his pen to answer Vane, and found that he did not know what to write. At Renmere, meanwhile, the dying house had begun, very faintly, and against all expectation, to breathe. It began with water. Eloan set the men to the choked drains of the north fields first, because water, her father had always said, is the one debt that land will always call in. For 3 days 12 men and half again as many women dug out the silted ditches by hand, and on the 4th morning the water ran, brown and grudging at the first, and then cleared down channels that had lain dead for years. By the week's end, the sour, waterlogged low ground had begun to firm beneath the boot, and a faint haze of green showed where the grass had taken heart again. Then the barns. Bram, it emerged, had been a fair thatcher in his youth, and under his cracked and wandering direction the worst of the roofs were closed against the coming rains. Eloan sold 2 silver candelabra from the hall's dining room. No one had troubled to light a candle in that room in years, and with the money she bought at last the mortar that Ambrose Fan had asked for 4 times over and never once received. The stone walls rose again. The gates were rehung upon both their hinges. Children who had been sent away to the mills came back to glean and to carry and to shout across the open fields, and the sound of them was a strange half-forgotten music in a place that had forgotten how to make it. Eloan worked among them every day of it, until her hands cracked and her fine gowns were fit for nothing but the ragback. And a curious thing came to pass which she had never planned and could not have purchased at any price. The people of Renmere watched their duchess kneel in the ditch water at their sides, and they left off calling her Frail, and they began, without ever quite deciding to call her ours. On the last evening of that first hard month, when the north field showed green from the ridge clear down to the beck, Ambrose Fenn's wife did a thing that no one had asked of her. She and 3 of the other women cooked, and they carried it all up to the hall, and they laid the long dining table, the very table across which Eloan had drawn her finger through the dust on her first morning, with plain good food and borrowed plates, and they filled the great hall with living, breathing people. They ate together that night, the Duchess and the tenants of Renmere both. Beneath a water-stained plaster, and by the light of the very last of the candles, someone had brought a fiddle. Tamsin fell asleep in Eloan's lap before the end of it, sticky-faced and wholly content, and Eloan sat very still so as not to wake her, and looked down the length of that crowded, noisy living table, and thought that she had never in the whole of her life been in a place that felt so much like a home. She was still thinking it when Bram came in from the yard with the wrong look upon his face. He did not speak. He only crossed to Ambrose and bent to his ear, and Alowan watched the old farmer's face change as he listened. And then she was already on her feet with the sleeping child gathered up against her, and the whole hall was rising with her. Through the tall, dark windows, away across the fields, they had bled a month of their lives to save. The sky was the wrong color. It was orange, and it was growing. The hayricks were burning. They ran into the dark toward the burning, all of them at once, the whole hall emptying out across the black fields with buckets and horse blankets in bare hands. The nearest beck lay 100 yards off, and they made a chain to it and beat at the edges of the blaze with wet sacking, while the ricks roared and flung sparks up into a windless sky. It was the windlessness that saved them in the end. Had there been any breath of wind at all, the whole of Renmir's winter hay would have gone up together, and the beasts that depended on it would have starved by spring. As it was, they saved a little better than half 4 ricks of the 7, and stood in the reeking gray dawn, black to the elbows, coughing, watching the last of the rest fall in upon itself in a soft collapse of ash. Bram found the how of it while the embers still glowed, a broken lantern flung deep into the heart of the second rick where the fire had burned hottest. And in the soft mud of the lane beyond the field, the prints of a shod horse that belonged to no one at Renmir, come in the night and gone again before the alarm. No one spoke Vane's name aloud. No one had any need to. Alowan looked round at the exhausted, soot-streaked faces and understood the true cruelty of the thing that had been done. The fire had not been set only to burn hay. It had been set to burn hope, to say to every family who had dared to trust her, "See now what comes of it. Give it up. Go back to the mills. Renmir is a dying place, and the dying cannot be saved." She could feel it working too in the silence around her. She could feel the fear settling back down over them all, soft and gray as the falling ash. So she did not send them home to brood upon it. "The barley in the east field stands near ripe," she said, and her voice carried flat and steady across the smoking ruin. "Vane has shown us his hand tonight. He is afraid." A man who was winning would have no need to creep about in the dark with a lantern. We are nearer to beating him than he can stomach. That is what this fire tells me. So, we will wash, and we will eat, and then we will get that barley in before he thinks to send his rider back. He has told us we are finished. She let that sit a moment. I say we make a liar of him before nightfall. It was Harwick who had spat upon her floor and named her a dying girl, who bent and took up his blackened bucket first, and turned toward the east field, and after him, one by one, the others turned and followed. But Osric Vane did not creep only in the dark. Within the week the squeeze came on in daylight and on paper, which was where the man was truly dangerous. Formal quit notices arrived for 6 of the tenant families, drawn up in faultless legal form, citing years of arrears that had never existed anywhere but in Vane's own crooked ledger. A surveyor came, a bored, pencil-necked fellow who tramped the fields with a chain and a notebook and would answer no question put to him, taking the measure of Renmir for a sale not yet agreed. And worst of all, though, Alowan would not learn of it for some time. A letter went north. It was a masterful piece of work. It reported, in tones of the deepest and most respectful concern, that Her Grace the Duchess had, poor lady, declined most sadly, in both body and mind, that she had taken to summoning the tenantry and making wild speeches to them, that she had begun stripping the hall itself of its silver and its furnishings and handing the proceeds out among the farmers, and that the whole estate was fast descending into a disorder that only an immediate sale could hope to arrest. It was signed in sorrow and in duty by Osric Vane, agent. 200 miles to the north, Corin Ashford read it through once, and his hand closed slowly into a fist upon the desk. And yet, even as the paper squeeze drew tight, something moved the other way, something Vane had not reckoned upon and could not have stopped. On the 3rd morning after the fire, a young man came walking up the Renmir Drive with a bundle on his back, and the gray mill dust still ground into the creases of his hands. His name was Jory Wick, and his family had given up their tenancy 2 winters gone and taken themselves to the looms, as so many had before them. He had heard the way such things travel farm to farm, faster than any post, that the north fields at Renmere were green again, that the new Duchess dug her ditches at her people's side, and that she meant to fight Osric Vane and the devil together to keep the land in the hands that worked it. "I've come to ask if the Wick holding's still to be let, your grace," he said, twisting his cap between his fingers. "I'd sooner starve on ground of my own than eat my fill on another man's." Ilowan looked at him, and past him at the empty road, and understood that Jory Wick would not be the last to walk up that drive. Word was running out ahead of Vane now, out into the wide world beyond the estate, and word, once it has begun to run, is a very hard thing to burn. "It is to let," she said. "Welcome home." But even as she said it, she knew the true shape of her danger. Hope was spreading, and so was the sail, both racing now toward the same finish, the harvest. Whichever came in first would take Renmere for good, and she still had not one scrap of proof that a magistrate would hear. She needed far more than a green field and a brave word. She needed to break Osric Vane outright, and did not yet know how. She was still turning it over. Late that night, when old Ambrose Fenn came knocking at the hall door, his hat turning slow in his hands, and said the words that would change everything that came after. "Your Grace, there's a man you ought to meet, that is, if you've the stomach for a long walk in the dark." They walked up beneath a sky thick with low cloud and no moon at all. Ambrose ahead with a shuttered lantern, Ilowan behind in her plainest cloak, across 3 fields and a stile and down a rutted lane she had never had cause to take. At the end of it stood a single low cottage, one window lit a dull amber hunched against a hillside, as though it wished not to be found. "Who lives here?" she asked. "The man who held your books before Vane ever touched them," said Ambrose. "Elias Halloran, agent to the old Duke, near 30 year, honest as the day. Which is why he's here, and Vane's in a fine office in the town." The man who opened the door was old and stooped, with a milky cast to one eye, and a proud, wary set to his jaw. He knew Ambrose. He did not know the woman, and he made to shut the door until Ambrose said, "Lo, it's the new Duchess, Elias, the one they're all talking of. She's come to hear it." Halloran let them in. The cottage was poor but scrupulously kept, and on every surface there were papers, old ledgers, bound bundles of letters, the careful hoard of a man who had spent his life among accounts and could not stop keeping them even in his ruin. He told her his story slowly, as though each word cost him something. He had served the Winthorpes faithfully for 30 years. And then, near a decade past, the money had begun to go astray. Small sums first, then larger, all of it flowing through the hands of a clever young clerk the old Duke had lately taken on, a man named Osric Vane. When Halloran had begun to ask his questions, quietly, in the proper way, he had been dismissed within the month, not for theft, for Vane was too careful for that, but on a whispered charge of drunkenness that was wholly false and impossible to disprove. Blacklisted from every great house in 3 counties, he had crept home to this hillside to grow old and afraid. "I had a wife then, and a daughter," he said. Vane sent word by a friend that a man who spoke ill of him might find his family's roof afire some night. I held my tongue. I have held it 10 years. His good eye found hers bright and bitter. I am ashamed of that silence every day I live. But a frightened man tells himself that silence is prudence, and calls his cowardice by a kinder name. I know that trick better than most. Why speak now?" Ilowan asked gently. "Because my wife is in the ground these 2 years, and my daughter married safe away in Bristol, and there is nothing left for Vane to burn but an old man who is not much afraid of dying." He leaned forward. "And because you dug the ditches yourself, they tell me, in your wedding silk. A duchess in the mud. He shook his head slowly. I served 3 generations of gentry that would not have crossed a wet yard for a tenant. The land remembers who tends it, your grace. It always has. And so, it seems, do the people on it. Then he gave her the key. Not of iron, but the thing worth more than any iron key. A thief keeps 2 sets of books, Halloran said. He must. He shows one to his master all neat and grieving over the estate's poor luck, but he keeps a true one for himself, hidden close, for a man cannot rob a house for 10 years and not lose track of his own takings. I saw Vane's true book, but the once, long ago before he sent me packing, a green ledger brass at the corners that he kept locked in a strongbox in his own office and would let no clerk near. He tapped the table. Get that green book into a magistrate's hands, beside my papers here and the tenant's own receipts, and Osric Vane hangs himself with his own neat figures. Without it, it is only an old drunk's word against a respectable man's. That is the whole of it. That green book is the key to the lock. He fetched from beneath a loose hearthstone a slim oilcloth packet, the letters and figures he had saved and hidden and been too frightened to use for 10 long years. He put them into her hands. I could not do it alone, he said. One old man is nothing, but a duchess, and the tenantry, and God willing, the Duke himself. When he learns what has been done under his own name, he did not finish. He did not need to. Eloan closed her hands over the packet. You will not stand alone again, Mr. Halloran, she said. You have my word upon it. They walked home in silence, and she felt the weight of the plan settling into place, hard and clear. The tenant's receipts she could gather in a day, Halloran's papers she now held. All that was wanting was the green book, and the green book was locked in a strongbox in Vane's own office, in a town a half-day's ride away. But as they came over the last rise, with the dark bulk of Renmere below them and the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall, Ambrose stopped and lifted his weathered face to the sky and swore softly. That's no passing shower coming, your grace, he said. That's the equinox gale. I've felt it building 3 days in my knees. It'll be on us inside too, and it'll blow itself out over a week. He looked at her, and all the hope went grave in his eyes. The barley's in, but the wheat's dead, ripe, and standing in the fields this minute. If we don't get every ear of it under cover before that storm breaks, it goes flat and rots in the mud, and there's your failed harvest handed to Vane on a plate. Storm or no, sir. He drew a long breath. We've 1 day, perhaps a day and a night, to bring in a harvest that ought to take a fortnight. The letter reached Corin Winthorpe on a wet gray morning in the north, and he read it standing up, and then he sat down slowly, and then he read it again. Osric Vane's words were smooth as ever, the poor lady declining in body and mind, the wild speeches to the tenantry, the silver stripped from the hall and scattered among the farmers, the estate sliding toward a ruin that only a swift sail could arrest. It was a portrait of a household gone to pieces under a dying, deranged woman's hand, and every careful stroke of it urged the same conclusion: sell Renmere, and quickly, before the shame of it grew. A month before, Corinne might have believed it. A month before, he had wanted to believe such things of Renmere, had wanted the place, and the girl, and the whole reproachful weight of them, tidied quietly out of his life so that he might get on with the drowning business of the mine. But something in the letter would not sit right, and he turned it over in his tired mind through the whole of that long day, stripping the hall of its silver and giving the proceeds to the farmers. He knew what Vane meant him to see, a madwoman flinging away the family plate. But that was not what the words described, was it? A madwoman does not sell 2 candlesticks and buy mortar and roofing nails with the money. A madwoman does not make speeches to 20 tenant families and have them listen. There was a shape behind the letter that Vane had not intended him to see, and the more Corin looked at it, the more it looked less like a house falling apart and more like a house being fought for fiercely and by someone Vane was frightened of. He thought of the girl at the gate in the spring dawn. The level gray eyes that had not wept, had not pleaded, had only looked at him and said, "You are leaving," as though she had expected nothing better of him and been proved right. He had ridden away telling himself he was being kind. He had been telling himself a great many comfortable things for a great many months. That night he did not sleep. Before first light he had left the mine and its floods and its debts in the hands of his agent there, saddled the best horse in the town, and turned its head south. He told himself he went only to see the truth of it with his own eyes. He did not yet let himself ask why his heart was beating so hard, or why he drove the horse as though the devil himself were coming up behind. What followed at Renmere was the longest day of Aloan Ashford's life, and afterward, when she tried to recall it whole, it came back to her only in pieces, the way a fever comes back, bright fragments with darkness in between. Ambrose had read the sky true. There was one day, perhaps a day and a night, to bring in a harvest that ought by rights to have taken a fortnight, or lose the wheat flat in the mud and hand Vane his failed harvest after all. So she did not go to her bed that night. By the gray of the next dawn, every soul on the estate who could stand and swing a scythe was out in the wheat fields, and a good many who by rights ought not to have been, old men and women great, with child and children small as Tamsin coming behind to bind and to glean. There was no dividing of the harvest now, no, this is my field, and that is yours. There was only the wheat and the coming storm, and 20 families moving through the standing gold in one long, ragged line, like a single living thing. Aloan worked among them. She had bound sheaves since she was 7 years old, and her hands remembered the knack of it, though her fine gloves were soon worn through to ribbons, and word of that went down the line as well. The Duchess binding wheat with her own bleeding fingers, and it drove them harder than any overseer shouting could have done. Mrs. Pell brought bread and small ale out to the field on a hand-barrow, deaf and sour and tireless. Bram, far too old now for the scythe, drove the wagons up and back. Jory Wick, 3 days returned to his ground, cut like a man possessed by it. They cut, and they bound, and they stooked, and they loaded, and the wagons groaned up to the great stone barn beside the hall, and were emptied, and came rattling back again for more, all through that long, hot, heavy day, while away on the western rim of the sky a wall of blue-black cloud built itself higher and higher, and at last began to move. By dusk they had cut better than 3 parts of it, by full dark working. Now by lantern light in a fat harvest moon that the advancing cloud kept swallowing and grudgingly giving back, they had all but the last 2 fields in. The air had gone thick and strange and still, the way it does before the worst of a thing, and the horses laid their ears flat and would not settle in the traces. "Get it under cover," Aloan called down the line, her voice worn to a rasp. "Every last load into the barn. The storm may have the stubble and welcome to it, so long as we have the grain." And they very nearly did it. The first wind came just before midnight, a single cold gust out of the west, that flattened every lantern flame at once, and set every dog on the estate to barking. Then the rain, in a hard, sudden hiss across the open fields. Then the true wind, rising and rising with a sound like the sea in a cave, tearing at the last stooks, driving the rain flat and stinging into their faces as they ran the final wagons in. But they got them in. Streaming, staggering, half-blind, and roaring at one another over the gale, they ran the last load through the great doors of the barn, and the harvest of Renmere was under stone and slate at last. All of it, every ear, safe. They had won. For one soaked and reeling moment in the full roar of the storm, they knew beyond doubt that they had won, which was, of course, the one moment Osric Vane had been waiting for all along. No one ever saw quite how it began. Later some would swear they had glimpsed a second lantern moving at the far dark end of the stackyard, where no lantern of theirs had any business being. But of a sudden there was a new light in the streaming night. Another fire, The second in a month, only this one loosed into the teeth of a gale where it could do its worst, low and red and utterly sickeningly wrong. And then a boy's voice went up, shrieking thin over the wind, "The barn! The barn's afire. The grain's alight." Eloan turned, and her heart stopped dead in her chest. The whole of the harvest they had bled 2 days and a month of their lives to bring in, every ear of it, the estate's one hope, the one thing standing between 20 families and the winter road, was stacked dry as tinder inside that barn. And along its western wall, where the wind drove hardest and meanest, a line of flame had caught and was already climbing, fast, licking upward toward the old timber and the dry thatch and the heaped gold within. They ran for it. She ran for it, screaming for buckets, for the beck, for anything at all, knowing, even as she ran, that a bucket chain in this wind against a barn full of dry corn was nothing, was less than nothing, was a prayer flung uselessly into the teeth of a hurricane. And it was in that moment, as she ran through the flame-lit rain with her ruined skirts gathered up in her fists and her voice torn away to nothing, that she heard it, low beneath the storm. Hoofbeats, hard and fast, and close, a horse driven flat out and near to foundering. Coming up the Renmere Drive out of the black, she turned toward the sound, and through the sheeting rain, lit blood red by the burning wall, a great dark horse came thundering in through the broken gate and bore down straight upon her, its rider low over its streaming neck, cloaked and hooded and faceless in the dark, and there was no time to run, no time even to cry out. Barty Seb time enough to throw up one arm against the rushing shape of him as the horse reared screaming over her head. We will pause the story here, just for a moment. If it has taken hold of you the way we hope, do stay with us all the way to the end. And if you would, subscribe now, so that the next tale we tell finds its way to you as well. The horse came down hard, its hooves striking sparks from the wet cobbles a hand's breadth from where she stood, and the rider was out of the saddle before it had fully stopped, seizing her by both shoulders, hauling her bodily back from the reaching flames. She looked up into his face in the red light. It was Corinne, her husband, the Duke of Winthorpe, whom she had last seen riding away from her through this very gate in the gray of a spring dawn, come back to her now out of the storm, 200 miles and half a season later, soaked to the skin, gray and hollow with exhaustion, his eyes wild in the firelight. He wasted no breath on greeting, nor on shock, nor on the 100 questions in his face. He took in the burning barn in a single sweeping glance, the useless bucket chain, the wind, the doomed and heaped up grain, and became at once and wholly a man who had spent a hard and bitter year learning how to fight for the things he was in danger of losing. "The doors!" he roared, and his voice, a duke's voice, bred to command a county, cut clean through the storm where hers had been swallowed whole. Get the great doors open, all of them wide. Get the grain out into the rain, into the yard. The rain will do what your buckets cannot. Everything out, move, all of you, MOV. And they moved, because a voice like that is made in the bone to be obeyed. They flung the great doors wide, and they made not a bucket chain now, but a human one. A living rope of bodies stretching from the burning barn out into the drowning yard, and out through the smoke and the sparks and into the saving, drenching rain, came the harvest of Renmere, sack by sack and armful by armful, passed hand to hand down a line that had the Duke of Winthorpe at the one end of it and the Duchess at the other, and every last soul on the estate strung out between the two of them. The fire took the western wall. It took a corner of the ancient thatch. It did not, in the end, take the grain. The very storm that had threatened all day to ruin the harvest was the thing that drowned the fire meant to destroy it. And by the time the eastern sky began to go gray, the great barn stood black and smoking and half unroofed, and the whole harvest of Renmere sat out under the streaming dawn beneath 100 sacks, scorched a little at its edges, soaked to the husk, and saved. They had lost perhaps a tenth of it. They had saved all the rest. Aloan stood in the ruined dawn, swaying on her feet, black with smoke and soaked clean through, and found the Duke standing before her in the very same state, and neither of them for a long moment could find a single word to say. Then Corinne looked from her exhausted, triumphant face to the salvaged mountain of grain, to the crowd of soaked and cheering tenants who plainly, unmistakably, would have walked straight into the fire itself had she only asked it of them. And he said, very low, when in a voice that shook with something he could not yet name, "They wrote to me that you were dying. They tell lies about a great many things," said Aloan. "I have found it is generally best not to believe them." And to the vast astonishment of everyone standing in that yard, and most of all to his own, the cold and grieving Duke of Winthorpe put back his head in the gray falling rain and laughed. The Duke did not leave in the morning, as everyone had half expected that he would. He stayed, and for 3 days he did a thing that no Duke of Winthorpe had done within living memory. He worked. He stripped off his fine coat and set his own shoulder to rehanging the scorched barn doors. He rode the estate at Ambrose Fen's slow and deliberate side, and listened while the old man showed him the cleared drains, the mended walls, the green fields that had been mud and standing water in the spring. He sat at the long table in the great hall and ate the tenants' plain good food among the tenants themselves, and he said little, and he watched everything, and most of all he watched his wife. He watched her settle a quarrel between two families over a boundary stone with a fairness that sent both away satisfied. He watched her lift the sleeping Tamsin off the hearthrug and carry her out to her mother, without once losing the thread of the account she was giving. He watched her do, quietly, and with no fuss made of any of it, the work of a magistrate and a steward and a mistress of the house and a mother to the whole of it at once. This frail, dying girl he had married in order to be rid of, and left in the shell of a house to fade quietly out of his life. He had come south braced to find a ruin. He had found instead the only living thing for 200 miles that had made him want to stop lying. On the third night, when the hall had emptied and the great fire had burned down to a red glow, he found her still bent over the estate books by candlelight, and he drew up a chair across the table from her, and he told her the truth, all of it, because he found, to his own considerable surprise, that he could no longer bear that she should go on believing him merely cold. "You believe that I abandoned you here," he said. "You have every right in the world to believe it. I should like you to know the whole of what it was you were abandoned for." And he told her about Julian, about the elder brother who had been the son of the family, charming, reckless, beloved by every soul who met him, born to the title as easily as Corin had never been, about the mine in the north that Julian had been so unshakably certain of, the fortune he had poured down into it more and always more, the whole liquid strength of the dukedom, and then great sums borrowed against the very land itself, about the wet gray morning 3 years past when Julian had taken offense too fast on a hunter he had no business astride, and broken his neck in the long grass and left Corin, the second son, the spare, the quiet one nobody had prepared for anything, to inherit a title and a grief and a secret mountain of debt, all in one single black week. 3 days after we laid him in the ground, the first gallery of the mine flooded. Corin sat, his eyes fixed on the dying fire. Everything he had sunk into it, gone under the black water in a night. Everything the family still had, tied up in the thing and sinking with it, and I could tell not a living soul. A duke whose debts are known is a duke whose tenants are turned out and whose creditors come down like crows on a carcass. So I have spent 3 years lying to the whole of the world with a level face, pumping that cursed mine day and night, borrowing at ruinous rates to pay the interest on what I already owed, holding the whole rotten edifice up with my 2 bare hands and praying only that it might last long enough to be saved. He was silent a moment, the candle guttered between them. "And in the deepest of last winter," he went on, lower still, "my man of business told me there was yet one clean thing I might do, a marriage, not to an heiress, I had nothing to offer an heiress, and any family with sense would have looked too closely at my books. But there was, he said, a scholar's daughter, gently bred, fallen on hard times, whose father lay in debt to a man whose paper I might buy up cheaply, a quiet girl, biddable, undemanding, and, his jaw went tight, and not, they gave me to understand, very long for this world. A fever had marked her. She would ask nothing of me, and expect nothing of me, and trouble no one at all, and in a year or two the sad business would end of its own accord, and I should have done a Christian kindness into the bargain, and have a wife's name on the family register besides. He made himself lift his eyes to her face. That is what I was told, and that is what I chose. I married you, Eloan, because I was assured you would make no claim upon a man who had nothing left in him to give, and because I believed that you were dying, and that loving you would therefore cost me nothing at all. I have never in the whole of my life been so ashamed of any single thing as I am of that. The fire ticked. The rain had stopped at last. Some hours since, the old house stood very still and listening around them. Eloan did not weep, and she did not rage. She sat with her chapped and roughened hands folded upon the ledger, and she looked at him steadily for a long moment, and then she said, "Then we have each of us married under false colors, your grace, for I am not dying. I never was." And she told him her own truth in turn, the fever that had marked her but never broken her, the strong, farm-bred body beneath the pale invalid the town had been so pleased to invent, the strange freedom she had learned to find in being thought too weak to be worth the watching. "They were all so very certain that I was too frail to notice a thief robbing this estate blind beneath my own nose," she said, and something bright and hard flashed for an instant in her gray eyes. "It is the one great advantage of being underestimated. I have found no one ever troubles to guard against a ghost." Corn looked at her, truly looked, the way he had not managed to look at another human soul in 3 long, grinding years, and felt the last of the ice he had packed so carefully around himself crack clean through. "I told myself I rode south to see the truth of it with my own eyes," he said slowly. "That was a lie too, I think. The truth is that I have thought of you every day since I rode away from that gate, and been ashamed of it, and could not stop however I tried." "Then it seems," said Eloan, and for the first time in his presence, something very near a smile touched her mouth, "that your Mr. Vane has done you one good turn after all, and entirely against his own intentions. Now," she laid her hand flat upon the false ledger between them, "shall we ruin him together before he can ruin the both of us?" For Vane, they were soon to learn, had been anything but idle. The moment word reached him that the harvest had been saved, that the Duke himself had come, and, worst of all, that old Elias Halloran had been seen walking up to the hall in the dark, Osric Vane understood that his long and patient game was collapsing under him. And a cornered thief does not lay down his hand. He overturns the table. He rode straight to Sir Aldous Merrick, the county magistrate, a decent enough man but an incurious one, and an old acquaintance of Vane's own making, and he laid before him a tale spun from the very same thread as his letter north, only barbed now. The Duchess of Winthorpe, he swore upon his honor, was either an impostor or a madwoman. She had been selling off the hall's plate and furnishings for months together, and pocketing the coin. She had stirred the tenantry to unlawful assembly and wild talk, and the estate, drowning in debt and now fallen into open disorder, must be placed at once under proper management and sold, per the agreement he happened to hold already drawn, to a most respectable northern gentleman, one Mr. Peregrine Marsh. He begged Sir Aldous to ride out to Renmere in 3 days' time, on the very day of the harvest home, when the whole estate would be gathered in the one place, at its proudest, so that the magistrate might see the disorder for himself, take the Duchess into custody, should it prove needful, and set his seal to the sale before the assembled crowd. He meant, in short, to walk into Renmere on its single day of triumph before all its gathered people, and take everything at a stroke. He does not know that I know, Corin said very grim when the news of it was carried to them. He believes he still deals with a distracted, grieving master who will thank him to be rid of the place. He does not dream that I have seen the books or spoken with Halloran, or that I mean to be standing at your shoulder when he arrives. A hard, bright light had come up in his eyes. So let him come. Let him bring his tame magistrate, and his sale papers, and his invented buyer. But when he comes, Eloan, we must hold in our hands the one thing that turns all of this from your word set against his into a rope knotted around his own neck. We must have the green ledger, and that he keeps locked in an iron strongbox in his own office, where neither duke nor duchess may lawfully lay a hand upon it. It was Mrs. Pell who broke the deadlock. Deaf, sour Mrs. Knott. Pell, who had spoken barely a dozen soft words to Eloan in half a year, and who now stood twisting her apron into a rope in the study doorway, her old chin trembling. "My grandson," she said. Toby Pell. He's been a clerk in Mr. Inksa, Vane's office, these 4 years. Your Grace, it was Vane himself got the boy the place, and I was that grateful to him at the time. God forgive an old fool." Her worn face worked, but my Toby's not slept right in a 12-month. He's seen things. He copies the figures, d'you see, out of a green book and into the gray one, morning upon morning, and he's no fool. My Toby, he knows full well what it is he's been set to copy. It's made him near sick to carry it. He'd never have come forward alone, for the fear of it. A clerk's word against his own master's. Who in the world would believe him, and where would he ever find honest work again after? But if the Duke of Winthorpe himself were to stand at the boy's back— She lifted her chin, and for a moment the sourness fell clean away and left something fierce beneath. "He's kept his own little book, sir. On the quiet. Every false entry he was ever made to write, and the true figure copied down beside it straight off the green book in his own hand. He kept it because he could not stomach not to. And I think my Toby would dearly love to be able to sleep of a night again." Corin and Eloan looked at one another across the length of the room. "Send for your grandson, Mrs. Pell," said the Duke quietly. "Tell him that he will not stand alone in this, not for one moment of it. Tell him that he will never again want for a place so long as this house stands upon its stones, and tell him," he added, "to be sure and bring his little book." Toby Pell came the next evening, on foot, by the field paths, so as not to be seen upon the road. He was a slight, ink-stained young man of perhaps 20, with his grandmother's chin and a hunted look about the eyes, and his hands shook so badly when he first stood in the study that he could not undo the strap of his satchel. But he undid it in the end, and he laid upon the table beside Halloran's 10-year hoard of hidden papers a small and shabby notebook filled edge to edge with a clerk's cramped, careful hand. They read it by candlelight, the 3 of them, deep into the night. And it was worse, far worse than even Eloan had guessed. Here was the drainage of the North Fields, paid for out of the estate's coin in 3 separate years. And here, in the true column, the plain figure, nothing spent, the work never ordered. Here were repairs to a dozen barns that had never felt a workman's hand. Here were rents come in from tenants long dead, still faithfully recorded as arrears against their grieving families. Here were whole years of Renmere's lifeblood, drawn off pound by careful pound into accounts that led, when Halloran traced them with a shaking finger across the page, to one Peregrine Marsh of the North, the very respectable buyer Vane meant to sell the estate to. Marsh was Vane. There had never been any Marsh at all. He had robbed the estate for 10 years, called the robbery debt, and now meant to buy the ruined thing from himself with the estate's own stolen money, and pocket it forever. It was all there. Halloran's papers gave them the beginning of the theft. Toby's little book gave them the proof of it, entry by damning entry. And the tenants Ambrose went out quietly that same night, and by dawn had gathered from a score of farms the small hoarded bundles of rent receipts that every wary family had kept, without ever quite knowing why. In a tin behind a loose brick, the tenants gave them the coin actually paid in figures that could not, to be made to match Vane's gray and lying book. 3 pillars, enough at last to hang the truth upon. Late that night, when the plan was laid and the boy sent safely to a bed he might actually sleep in, Corin found Eloan standing alone at the tall window of the great hall, looking out over the moonlit fields she had brought back from the dead. He came and stood beside her, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "Whatever comes of the morning after next," he said at last, "whether we break him or he finds some last trick to break us, I want you to know that I see you now. I was blind a long while. I called it grief, and I called it duty. And I dressed my cowardice up in fine, grave names, exactly as Halloran told me he once dressed his own. But I see you now, Eloan, and I do not believe there is a single soul left on this whole estate who does not." She turned from the window and looked up at him. The cold stranger from the spring gate, warm now and near, and no stranger to her at all. "Then that," she said softly, "is a beginning worth having. Let us see what the harvest brings us." And 1/2 mile off, alone in his comfortable office in the sleeping town, Osric Vane laid his sale papers neatly into a leather case and poured himself a glass of the Duke's own claret, and smiled, and thought himself just 2 short days away from being a rich man for the whole of the rest of his life. The day of the harvest home dawned clear and gold, as though the storm had never been. They kept the old custom in full. The last sheaf, dressed in ribbons, was carried up from the fields on a garlanded wagon with the children riding atop it shrieking. Long tables were set out on the grass before the hall, and the smell of roasting meat hung over everything, and there was a barrel broached, and the fiddler tuning, and every soul on the estate scrubbed and in their Sunday best beneath a sky washed clean and blue. Renmere, which in the spring had been a corpse of a house standing over dead ground, was on that afternoon the most alive place in the whole of the county. It was into the very middle of this, at the height of the afternoon, that Osric Vane's carriage came rolling up the drive, with the county magistrate's own carriage close behind it. The fiddle faltered and died. The talk fell away. Vane climbed down in his good coat, leather case in hand, and surveyed the gathered estate with a look of grave and practiced sorrow. And if he was surprised to see the fields brought in and the people fat and cheerful and the hall garlanded, he mastered it well. Behind him, stout and uneasy, came Sir Aldous Merrick. Vane did not trouble to seek out the Duke in the crowd. He addressed himself directly to the magistrate, pitching his voice to carry, so that the whole assembly should hear and understand what was being done to it. "You see it for yourself, Sir Aldous," he said heavily. "The poor deluded creature has squandered the estate's last substance on this spectacle, to buy the affection of the tenantry, while the debts mount and the hall is stripped bare behind her. It is a great sadness, but the law is the law. I have here the deed of sale to Mr. Begia. Marsh and I must ask you to place her grace in your protection, for her own safety and the estate's, and to set your seal to the sale of Renmere," said the Duke of Winthorpe, stepping out from among his tenants, "to a man who does not exist." The silence that followed was absolute. Vane turned, and for the first time the smooth, grave mask slipped, and Eloan, watching closely, saw the raw animal calculation move behind his eyes as he understood that the master he had thought distracted and pliable was standing before him with a cold and level fury he had never once seen in 3 years of quiet robbery. "Your Grace," Vane said carefully, "I did not look to find you here. This is a painful business, and hardly fit for—" "It is entirely fit," said Corin. "Sir Aldous has come to see the truth of Renmere with his own eyes." "Let him see it then. All of it." He raised his voice. and it carried to the farthest table. "Alias Halloran, will you come forward?" And the old man came, stooped and half-blind, and steady, out of the crowd where he had been standing all along. Halloran, whom Vane had ruined and silenced and left to rot on a hillside for 10 years, and who now walked up to the magistrate with his 10-year hoard of papers held in both hands, and began, in a dry, clear voice, to tell what he had seen, and why he had been dismissed, and how the money had first begun to go astray. Vane laughed, a short, contemptuous sound, the word of a discharged drunkard. "Then perhaps," said Corin, "you will call this a drunkard too." And he beckoned, and young Toby Pell came out white-faced, from behind his grandmother's skirts, shaking, and laid his little notebook open upon the magistrate's table. Mr. Vane's own clerk. Copying, morning upon morning, out of a green ledger and into a grey one, he kept the true figures. Every false entry, Sir Aldous, and the honest sum beside it, the drainage paid for thrice and never dug. The rents of dead men logged as arrears, and every stolen pound of it running at the last into the pocket of your respectable Mr. Ray. Peregrine Marsh of the North. Corin's voice dropped and went colder than the grave. "Ask him, Sir Aldous, to produce Mr. Marsh. Ask him to produce the green ledger from the strong-box in his office. Or shall I tell the assembled estate why he cannot?" Vane's hand had gone to the leather case at his side, gripping it white-knuckled, as a drowning man grips a spar. And Aloan, stepping forward now to stand at her husband's shoulder, no invalid, no ghost, but the plain-gowned, clear-eyed mistress the whole estate had watched kneel in the ditch-water at their sides, spoke for the first time, quietly, into the ringing silence. "There was no fever ever robbed me of my wits, Mr. Vane," she said. "You looked at me, and you saw a dying girl too weak to count. It was the one honest mistake you ever made in this house. It was over very quickly after that." Sir Aldous Merrick, an incurious man but not in the end a dishonest one, read 3 pages of Toby Pell's book and Halloran's papers, and one of the tenants' hoarded receipts held up against Vane's own grey ledger, and the blood drained slowly out of his face. He did not need the green book. The green book would come later, prized from its strong-box by the king's officers. But he did not need it now. The man he had ridden out to assist stood exposed before the whole county as the greatest thief in it. They took Osric Vane away in the magistrate's own carriage, the one he had summoned to seal his triumph, and the leather case with its worthless sale papers was left behind upon the grass where he dropped it. There was no cottage for him, and no quiet pension, and no gentle obscurity. That was the mercy the old story might have given him, and Corin, in the first heat of it, had wanted a great deal worse, had wanted with a rage 3 years in the building, to see the man broken utterly, ruined past all recovery, made to suffer as Renmere had suffered. But it was Aloan who stayed his hand, there at the last, with a few low words meant for him alone. "Not vengeance," she said. "Vengeance is what a small man does with power, and you are not a small man. Let the law have him. Let him give back every pound, to the last farthing, to the families he starved. That is what is owed, and owing is a truer justice than any suffering you could wish on him." She looked at Vane's retreating carriage. He wanted to be a rich man. Let him be a poor one, and a marked one for the rest of his days, and let every pound he stole go home to the ground it came from. He will feel that longer than he would ever feel a rope, and so it was. The stolen fortune, traced through Vane's own meticulous green book, was clawed back over the following year and returned, to the estate and to the tenants, and even in no small part to the drowning workings of a mine 200 miles to the north, so that the debt that had haunted the Duke of Winthorpe began, for the first time in 3 years, to recede like a tide going out. But that was all still to come. On the afternoon itself, when the carriages had gone and the shock had passed, a strange thing happened on the grass before Renmere Hall. It was Ambrose Fenn who began it, of course. The old farmer climbed up onto the garlanded harvest wagon, slow and creaking, and he raised his mug, and he looked down at the small, plain woman standing beside the Duke, and he said, in a voice cracked with age and feeling, and gone suddenly rough, "In the spring, this was a dead house on dead ground, and we were dead men on it." And then she came. He did not manage anything finer than that. He was not a man of fine words. She came, and look at it now. Look at it now. And the whole estate, 20 families and their children, and their old ones, every soul that Renmere had left in the world, rose up off the benches and lifted their cups to Aloan Ashford, the frail bride who had not faded, and the sound of it rolled up and over the mended walls and the full black barn and the green reclaimed fields, and filled the great hall through its open doors, and filled the whole of the estate to its farthest hedge. The empty manor the Duke had left to die had become by harvest the beating heart of everything around it, and its heart was her. The Duke of Winthorpe stayed on at Renmere through the autumn, and then through the winter, and somewhere, in the quiet turning of those months, the marriage that had been made of paper and false report became, without either of them ever quite naming the day, a true one. It was made of small things in the end, as the truest things generally are. It was made of evenings in the great hall over the estate books, their two heads bent together in the candlelight, arguing amiably over drainage and rents. It was made of the morning he came down to breakfast and found she had learned, from Mrs. Pell, how he took his coffee, and had said nothing about it, and simply had it there. It was made of the afternoon. He watched her lift Tamsin onto the mended pasture wall to see over it, and felt something turn over in his chest that he had thought Julian's death had killed in him for good. He did not ask her the great question all at once. He was not, whatever the county now said of him, a hasty man, but one clear, cold morning near the turn of the year he found her out at the front gate, the same gate that had hung broken on its hinge and would not close, the morning he rode away and left her, and he saw that in the autumn's mending it had been set right at last and hung true, and swung shut clean and sound upon its post. "I have been thinking," he said, "of the morning I left you here. I told myself I was being kind. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." He turned to face her in the thin winter sun. "I married you as a stranger, Aloan, for the worst of reasons, and left you to die alone. I should like, if you will have it, and God knows you have no earthly reason to be married to you now, truly, for the best of them." Aloan looked at the mended gate, and at the great house standing whole and breathing behind them, and at the grave, warm, no longer cold man before her, who had ridden 200 miles through a storm to find her. "I bought my way into a stranger's house to save my father," she said slowly, "and I found the only home I have ever had. I think that is the best of reasons, Corin. I think I should like to keep it. That was all. There was no more asked and none needed." He took her cold hand in his, there at the gate that closed now as it should, and they walked back up to the house together. By the following harvest, Renmere was unrecognizable. Elias Halloran was steward again, restored to the office Vane had stolen from him 10 years before, and he grew visibly younger for it, his back a little straighter with every passing season. Young Toby Pell kept the books beneath him now honestly, and slept, his grandmother reported with tart satisfaction, like a stone every night. The stolen money came home pound by pound and went where it was owed. The tenants who had cast in their lot with the frail bride found their arrears wiped clean and their roofs sound and their leases secure for their children after them. Jerry Wick married a girl from the next valley and took on the old mill fields beside his own, and even the cursed mine in the north, fed at last by the recovered fortune and by a duke who no longer had to hide, was pumped dry and shored up and turned in its first honest profit in 3 years, so that the secret debt that had so nearly swallowed the house of Winthorpe receded and receded until one day Corin looked at the accounts and found, to his quiet astonishment, that it was simply gone, but the ledgers were the least of it. The real change was the one the title of no account could ever hold. Renmere Hall, the forgotten manor that a grieving man had left in the dark to rot, had become the heart of the whole estate, the place the tenants came to be married and to bury their dead and to settle their quarrels. The place with light in its windows and smoke from its chimneys and a long table that was seldom empty. The place a small girl named Tamsin ran in and out of, as though she owned it, which, in every way that mattered, she rather did. On a gold evening, much like the one on which it had all turned, Eloan sat on the mended pasture wall with her husband beside her, watching the last of the harvest come up from the fields, and Tamsin came running across the grass with her fist held tight shut, the way she had that first muddy morning a lifetime ago. She opened it. A single blackberry, dark and perfect, warm from the carrying for you, the child said, because you're happy now. Eloan took it as though it were a jewel, which it was, and she was. They tell the story still, in that corner of the country, of the frail bride left to die in an empty house, and how by harvest she had made it the heart of everything, of the cold duke who learned to see, of the honest man restored and the thief brought low and the dead ground brought back to life. It is a true story. And the truest thing in it is this, that the people written off as too weak to matter are so very often the ones quietly holding up the world, and that a little kindness and a little courage and a refusal to fade when the world has decided you should, can bring even a dead house back to breathing.